When officers released K9 dogs on a young black woman holding her newborn, they believed she was just another suspect to intimidate. What they didn't know was her past. She was a former elite U.S. military dog handler, trained to command and communicate with even the most aggressive K9s. This incredible story of hidden strength, unexpected kindness, and life-changing recognition shows how one woman's gentle courage transformed an entire police department's understanding of true heroism. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button. Why? Because each like tells YouTube, this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I do read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. And don't forget to share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. The porch light hummed and stuttered like a tired sentinel. Aisha Canty sat on the top step with the baby bundled against her chest, the infant's breaths matching the soft rhythm of the old house. Inhale, small pause, exhale. The night smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen, oil from the neighbor's truck, a faint sweetness of someone's laundry, and the iron tinge of the city that never truly slept. Cradling that tiny, perfect weight, Aisha felt an ache behind her ribs that had nothing to do with hunger. It was a hollow that whispered in late hours, in the cramped quiet between deadlines for rent and calls from a VA office that promised a return call soon. She had learned to measure time in waiting lists and forms. Since returning from deployment, the world had felt like a ledger with too many columns and not enough ink. Her left leg carried a memory of an order that had gone sideways overseas, a limp that announced itself on hills and on nights when stress tightened the wires of her shoulders. She kept her hair tightly braided because it made the mirror more honest, fewer stray strands to lie about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Aisha's hands were the kind that had learned to be precise by necessity. One hand to soothe a startled dog, two to secure a harness, the same hands that now knew the miracle of bathing a newborn in a sink because the apartment's bathtub was cracked and cold. Neighbors called her quiet, which was a Christian euphemism for mysterious. She preferred quiet. It kept the flashbacks at bay, the sudden clang in the stairwell that could translate into mortar fire for the mind, the sharp bark of a dog that might carry a command in another language. Quiet also kept questions from others. Are you okay? Which were well-meaning but heavy with their own expectations. This evening began with a kind of small miseries that turned domestic life into a test of stamina. Her landlord had left a note in the hallway. 2 weeks. The baby's formula coupons had run out and the bank app glared at her with a balance that read like an accusation. Her phone, threaded with messages of concern and offers to help that felt more like obligations than relief, sat face down on the kitchen counter. Aisha had learned the arithmetic of pride and need. Ask too often and you risked being a burden. Ask too seldom and you risked losing the fragile scaffolding that kept you upright. Then someone below, maybe the neighbor with the overdue car horn and the grudge about a late trash day, banged on the bottom stair and shouted about noise. The shout became a call in someone's head to call the police. The sirens came like punctuation, sharp, unsettling. Aisha's adrenaline rose not because she feared the neighbors, but because the memory of leashed dogs in the dark was threaded into the same muscle memory as obedience drills from base. She had trained dogs to detect, to guard, to protect. She knew how quickly fear could flip into a violent, reflexive response. Footsteps pounded the walkway. Flashlights painted slices across the porch. A voice, clipped, professional, practiced, asked for identification. She stood, reflexively tighter with the baby, and opened the door just enough to tilt the beam of light away. There was a K9 unit parked under the streetlight, two black vans with their insignia punched into the metal, handlers speaking in low tones she could not quite catch. She felt the old soldier's inventory checklist move through her mind: weapons, leashes, children. Her chest tightened, but she forced her face into a mask she remembered wearing under harsh lights and stranger uniforms. Calm, controlled, authoritative enough to keep those in her charge from spiraling. The lead officer's eyes skimmed her, then settled. They saw a young black mother on a broken porch. They did not, at first glance, see the muscles beneath the surface that had learned to read a dog's micro-expressions the way other people read newspapers. They did not see the way her hands could curl into a calming hold or the low tone she could summon that made animals search for meaning and not danger. What they saw, in the superimposed vocabulary of calls and files, was potential threat. It was a shorthand born from decades of policing that often mistook survival instincts for aggression. When the K9 van door hissed and the first dog was released, time narrowed. The canine was a powerful, coiled thing, a blend of trained obedience and raw appetite for motion. It lunged, driven by scent and command. Aisha didn't yell. She didn't fling herself into the path of the animal with reckless abandon. Training had long ago taught her that escalation could be a contagion. One shout, one sudden move, one flared nerve could set off a cascade. Instead, she did the thing she had practiced in countless runs at dawn when the world was still forgiving. She lowered her voice. Her words were not human speech meant for the officers, but the softer consonants and breath patterns she had learned while working with dogs, sounds that told the animal there was nothing to prove, no hunt to pursue. She cradled the baby closer and turned her shoulder sideways in a practiced clearance that made the approach less threatening. Her palms were visible, empty, patient, gestures she hoped would translate in the animal's mind from target to caretaker. For a baffling, heartless second the dog hesitated. The handlers cursed and pulled on their leashes. Flashlight beams jittered. Someone barked commands, clipped and foreign to the dog's last training cue. Aisha met the dog's gaze with a steadiness that surprised even her. She was a woman who could load a harness by feel in complete darkness. She was a woman who had pacified an animal acting on fear more dangerous than hunger. She put a hand out, palm up, and offered the kind of stillness that is its own kind of shelter. Around them the neighborhood hummed with distance, someone's television laugh track, the muffled cadence of a late-night program, a car door shutting 2 blocks away. Inside Aisha, everything was precise and immediate: the baby's tiny chest, her own measured breath, the dog's ear tilt, the officer's tightening jaw. She found the command that had always worked in turbulent moments, a low rolling sound through her throat that spoke of the familiar, a voice pattern rooted not in authority but in reassurance. The canine stepped forward on cautious feet. Its nostrils flared. It sampled the air like a judge tasting wine. It sniffed the baby, then Aisha's hand, then returned to her face as if asking permission to accept a new map of the world. A slow exhale left the dog, and with it, the electric edge of the moment thinned. The officers, who had been ready to act, lowered their shoulders by degrees. One handler, jaw set, let the leash slacken a fraction and muttered, almost to himself, "Huh." Aisha did what she always did after a successful de-escalation. She whispered a small, grateful sentence, to nobody, to the dog, to God, and then, by instinct, looked at the faces of the officers. In them she saw a mixture of confusion and something else, surprise maybe, at the gentleness that had worked without glare. A shadow of shame flickered across the lead officer's features, like the first cold wind of winter hitting an exposed neck. She could have left then, folded her baby into the safe geometry of their night, and moved on. She had practiced leaving as survival. But she didn't. Someone in the crowd had watched her. Not the officers, not the ones who made the decisions. An older woman who had stationed herself near the lamplight as if by accident. Evelyn Hart, who owned more businesses than the neighborhood had names for, had come that night to hand out flyers about a community health initiative. She was tall in a way that made people turn, not because she demanded their gaze, but because her posture suggested she had learned to balance a lot of weight without breaking. Evelyn's eyes had missed nothing. She watched Aisha handle fear with a tenderness that transmuted into authority. That small sight, a mother, a soldier, a handler, moved something in her that she had not expected. In a world where power often traded in spectacle, this quiet solvency felt like truth. Aisha, meanwhile, returned the baby to the crook of her neck and listened to the residual hum of the night settling back. She placed a soft kiss on the infant's forehead and let herself unbreathe for the first time. She was tired in ways money could not touch, and hopeful only in the slenderest of muscles, the one that made you get up the next morning and feed a child. She did not know yet the ripple that a single calm breath would send through her life. She only knew how to stay steady. That steadiness had carried her through deployments and would, in ways she could not imagine that night, open a door when it mattered most. Pause for a moment. When have you seen quiet steadiness create safety for others? Share the memory in the comments and consider how small acts can reshape someone's night. When the second van door opened, the night's tension doubled. Two dogs, trained to read the smallest human flinch and react in a heartbeat, unfolded into the porch light with a kinetic force that made the wood under Aisha's feet shudder. The handlers moved like rehearsed shadows, lean bodies, and clipped commands, a choreography meant to control danger. For them, the dogs were instruments. For Aisha, they were living beings whose mouths and eyes carried histories. The first animal had already quieted beside her, its body taut but accepting the new map she'd given it. The second was younger, a blur of muscle and nerves that hummed like a live wire. It came forward on a rush of curiosity, teeth glimpsing, jaw working as if searching for a command it understood. A neighbor's toddler, drawn by the commotion, peered from behind a curtain. Someone in the crowd muttered about danger and what-ifs. The lead handler tightened the leash and barked an order that did nothing to soothe. Aisha felt something else beneath the adrenaline, an instinct older than the uniform, harder than the paperwork. She had been the handler who learned the hard language of canine fear and trust, not because it was glamorous but because it saved people. She remembered a winter in Kandahar when a jittery dog had frozen on a ridge and only a patient hand had told it the world would not fall apart. She remembered the look the dog gave afterward, not gratitude like a human's but a kind of relief that felt like a small benediction. She stepped forward before the officers could react. It wasn't a challenge so much as an offering, a human who knew how to be still. Aisha made no sudden move. She kept her steps measured, her palms turned open to the dogs and to the world. She spoke in the same low cadences she'd used in kennels and on dusty ramps, a sound that carried no accusation and no command, but an invitation to breathe. The young dog barked once, high unsure, then nosed toward the baby. The handler flinched to yank the leash taut. Aisha's hand moved between them like a bridge. Her fingers grazed the dog's flank, careful and confident. The animal flinched but did not snap. She murmured to it in sounds that were almost vowelless, a series of throaty comforts she had honed over years of early morning drills and sleepless watches. Her voice was not the authority of an order, but the steadiness of someone who had sat with fear for longer than was polite. A hush spread through the porch crowd. The sound of cars and distant televisions dimmed to a hush because people's bodies leaned forward to see whether the animal would lunge, whether the handlers would pull, whether chaos would commit itself to the night. The handler's fingers on the leash blanched and whitened as pressure increased. Someone shouted, "Step back." Aisha's other hand went instinctively to the baby's head, cradling the warm curl of hair and the thin pulse beneath. She did not hide the infant. She did not draw the shield of panic. She made the mother's choice, expose what mattered so the danger could see the impossible, a face small and blameless that deserved protection, which in turn demanded restraint. The younger dog, heart like a drum, reached for Aisha's hand and sniffed. Then, impossibly, it leaned into the palm as if requesting an answer. Aisha felt the tremor in its spine, the residual scent of adrenaline and training. She fed it a small, unprofessional kindness. She let her thumb run lightly along its ear, tracing the soft ridge where the fur met thicker muscle. The dog exhaled like a man released from a gasp. It's a tiny thing, she thought, so tiny to a stranger, but a shift in the animal's breathing was a pivot away from chaos. The lead handler's face raked through 100 judgments in seconds: responsibility, protocol, assertion. He stepped forward, jaw set. "Ma'am, you need to step back. This is an active." "It's okay," Aisha said, her voice the same low instrument that had been answering dog breaths for years. "He's scared. He's not the enemy." Somewhere in the exchange was the crux of the night: policy versus flesh, procedure versus mercy. The handler's hand tightened again on the leash. The dog's pupils were wide and dark, reflecting 1,000 small lights in the street. Aisha's wrist brushed an old scar that throbbed. Her knees flexed to steady the weight of the baby. She was tired, but the tiredness had nothing to do with defeat. It came from a place that understood the cost of giving in to fear. For a moment the world narrowed down to 3 beings on the porch: Aisha, the young dog and the baby, and one person in the shadows who watched with a near-invisible hand at her purse: Evelyn Hart. The volunteer badge pinned to Evelyn's chest fluttered in the porch wind and looked awkward against clothing that had been cut for confident rooms and polished floors. She did not move. That was her style, to let the scene reveal itself. People like Evelyn had learned that power is often louder when it is patient. Aisha's body language did more than calm a dog. It argued a different way of seeing. She did not look like someone asking for validation. She looked like a woman doing what she had to do. The young dog settled a fraction, a micro-hesitation that was its own kind of consent. The handler, perplexed, loosened his grip almost imperceptibly. Aisha breathed in and out in a pattern small and steady enough to be infectious. The dog's breathing matched hers. It is a strange, tender mathematics when an animal and a person find the same tempo. When she finished, she did not smile triumphantly. She gave the dog one more soft rub along its flank, as if to tell it the world was still safe. Then she turned to the officers and said, "We're okay." Her voice contained no accusation. If anything, it carried a tired pardon. One of the younger officers, a kid with the tightness of someone who had not yet learned how history could complicate a uniform, swallowed and said something like, "Sorry, ma'am. We got a coal." A neighbor, who had called in the first place, pushed through the crowd with a complaint and a story that didn't hold up under scrutiny. An argument flared. A man insisted Aisha had been loud and reckless. Another said she'd just been calming her child. Voices rose and fell in the noisy smallness of people who do not like their routines interrupted. Aisha's small mercy had a second, quieter effect. While she calmed the dogs, a woman in the crowd sobbed and gripped her own chest. It was Mrs. Latham from 2 doors down, a woman who'd lost her husband the previous year and who had, until that evening, been brittle with grief. She approached with shaky hands and, with a couple of sentences that left her voice thin, told Aisha she'd never seen anyone be that gentle. Mrs. Latham's applause was not loud. It was a hand to her own mouth, a noise like being close to a piano that had stopped but still hummed. Evelyn watched the scene with the clean, astonished attention of someone cataloging the world. The woman's hands, which usually closed around ledgers and names, hovered at the edge of the moment because she recognized an overlay of competence and tenderness that rarely showed itself so clearly. She noticed the scar on Aisha's forearm, the way the new mother's fingers kept the infant's blanket tucked, and the posture that was equally maternal and tactical. She filed the data away in a place where she kept mental bookmarks for people to remember. After the dogs were recaptured and secured, the officers did something Aisha had not expected. They offered no apology, but they also did not escalate. The night's energy decompressed into small talk and paperwork. Someone took a statement, someone else checked the baby's temperature, a neighbor fetched a blanket. Aisha answered questions in short bursts, careful not to let the narrative of the evening inflate into something it had not been. She was aware, always, of how easily a story could be told to her detriment. Evelyn stepped closer then, ostensibly to offer a flyer about a community health fair. Her small slip of paper was a cover. "You handled that with grace," she said softly, and the word landed like a coin. Aisha shrugged as if to dismiss praise that she didn't want. "Just did what I had to." "That takes a person," Evelyn said. She hesitated, weighing the claim. "Do you work with dogs professionally?" "For the military. Before." Aisha didn't volunteer more. Why would she? Vulnerability could be its own tax. The exchange was brief but clean. It held a current neither of them wanted to name aloud. Evelyn folded the flyer into a pocket and offered Aisha a look that read like an invitation. Not to a charity, that was not her style, but to be seen. In the crowd, people dispersed, gossip already contracting into retellings that would be sharper than the night. The handlers ushered their dogs back into the vans, their movements brisk, the engines coughing awake. The porch cooled. Aisha walked back inside with her baby, the world reshaped around a small mercy that had felt like survival. She propped the infant into the crook of her arm and, for the first time since the sirens, allowed a single shaky laugh to escape, not from triumph but from the brittle relief of having kept something precious safe. Take a moment. Have you ever seen someone de-escalate danger with calm instead of force? Share that memory in the comments and tell us what it taught you about courage and compassion. Morning came with a thin, stubborn light that wedged itself between the blinds and the threadbare curtains. Aisha woke to the small, urgent orchestra of a newborn. A sigh, a hiccup, a tiny hand exploring the world like it had never seen anything before. The night's adrenaline had receded into an ache behind her ribs, where memory and muscle kept their own accounts. She boiled water on the tiny electric stove, warmed a bottle, and fed the baby while the city outside blinked itself awake. Buses idling, a dog barking 2 houses down, the faint clack of someone sweeping a stoop. There was no fanfare the next morning. No one came with a check or a cheering band. That is the particular cruelty and mercy of life on the edge. Great moments can be swallowed by routine and stillness. Aisha pushed through her morning like she pushed through everything, one pragmatic step after another. She dressed quietly, wrapped the baby against her chest with a blanket stitched loose from a thrift store find, and walked to the corner where the bus would take her to the temp job at the distribution center. The job was steady if uninspired. Fold boxes, meet quotas, smile like you have the energy for it. It paid enough to keep lights on and sometimes, if she was careful, to buy a small treat for the baby. Neighbors waved with the casual distance of people who know each other by the sound of their lives rather than the details. Mrs. Latham, still recovering from grief, greeted Aisha with a shaky smile that felt like sunlight through ice. At the corner store, the clerk, a young man named Isaiah who had once been in her platoon on a supply run and now worked afternoons between community college classes, handed her a carton of discounted formula in exchange for a favor she would owe him later. Small economies of kindness circulated, favors, advice. A casserole slid through a doorway at the right hour. Aisha traded these tokens like currency that smelled faintly of salt and tired hope. At work, the day unfolded in drudgery and small satisfactions. She took pride in a shift done cleanly, in a pallet stacked square and true. The foreman, a broad-shouldered woman named Carla, had a soft respect for people who did their work without drama. Twice a week Aisha ran her hands over the warehouse dogs, a courtesy to the resident mutt that had adopted the loading dock and a comfort that let her mind rest for a few minutes between boxes. Her hands were calloused in a way that made parenting and labor feel braided together. Both tasks demanded patience, precision, and a refusal to be undone by fatigue. Yet every paycheck came with a thin ledger of things unpaid. An email from the VA about missing paperwork, a call to schedule an appointment that never fit within the hours of her shift, a rent reminder that read like a future eviction. She kept these notices in a drawer under the sink, folded like paper prayers. When she could, she called the veteran support line and got transferred until she reached a person who said they would look into it, and then never did. The institutional promise to care felt like a map that always led to a foggy clearing. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hart did not stop watching. She didn't hover outside the apartment building or announce herself like a benefactor dropping off goods. Evelyn's method was quieter and, to her mind, more powerful, observation, than carefully plotted action. That week she found herself thinking about the woman on the porch, not as a story to tell at dinner parties, but as a datum to be studied. She asked the community outreach coordinator for a list of people who'd come by the health fair near the end of last month. She made a few calls, polite and imprecise, to find out more about the neighborhood's needs. Evelyn was good at this. She had built programs in places that most people assumed were beyond help: literacy nights at laundromats, scholarship funds tucked into small schools, mental health clinics held in converted storefronts. She could read a neighborhood's heartbeat from a single conversation, and, importantly, she had the bandwidth to follow through. But her interest in Aisha wasn't purely about generosity. It was about recognition, a recognition that something precise and useful had been overlooked, a skill set that deserved a scaffold rather than a headline. One afternoon Evelyn took a different tack. She asked a familiar intermediary, a program director at a veterans nonprofit who owed her a favor, if they'd help her learn more about military K-9 handlers returning to civilian life. The director's voice carried the weary cadence of someone who had seen too many good intentions misfire. "We have a handful of handlers who struggle," he said. "A lot of them fall through because their skills don't map neatly to office jobs. But why? Is this about a program or a person?" "A person," Evelyn replied. "Someone I saw." The nonprofit came through as nonprofits do, with a list of forms, a meeting next Thursday, and a request for more documentation. Evelyn smiled and set a time. She wanted to see Aisha's life beyond a porchlight vignette. She wanted to know if the woman's training could be the seed to something larger. Behind the scenes, she also began to pull small threads: a referral to a local transitional housing program, a discreet call to a housing coordinator who sometimes cleared the wait list for exceptional cases. Evelyn preferred the word strategic to exceptional. She was careful with language because she knew how stories could warp. Back at the apartment, Aisha slept in stuttered bursts. The baby's demands ate into the hours where paperwork might be completed, where the VA's digital forms could be wrestled into submission. A week passed like a slow march. Her landlord left another note. Tension built into the cheap mattress and the cracked plaster. She found an unpaid notice tucked into a catalog and reread it until she could recite the numbers in her sleep. The kind of fatigue that stays beneath the bones settled in. She started to forget small things, like where she had put a favorite spoon or whether she'd closed the bathroom window. And yet the thing about people who survive messy realities is that they adapt in ways that look like ordinary magic. When the baby awoke with a fever one night, Aisha's instinct was precise. Remove the baby's layers, sponge with cool cloths, call the nurse line. The phone kept her on hold for a longer time than felt humane, but she stayed by the crib and sang the same soft, low cadence she'd used to calm dogs. The lullaby she hummed had no name, but it worked. The child's breathing slowed and the fever retreated by morning. She kept a notebook of those small wins, the practical logbook of a person who refused to let small emergencies become catastrophes. Word of that night on the porch diffused through the neighborhood in the gentle, messy way stories do in places where people's lives overlap. Someone mentioned it at the laundromat. A clerk told a shopper. A church group shared a folded account over coffee. Aisha didn't seek attention. In fact, she ducked it. But her reputation as the woman who calmed the dogs reached the ears of a local pastor, who mentioned in passing to the veterans' nonprofit director that a former handler had shown unusual care. That conversation landed on Evelyn's desk like a paper plane finally finding its target. The nonprofit director passed along what he knew: a name, a partial address, a note that the woman had a newborn. Evelyn called. This time she did not hide her intentions. She introduced herself as someone who ran programs and asked if Aisha would be willing to meet at a community center for coffee. Aisha, wary of patronizing offers, hesitated. She'd been offered rides, meals, and charity before, all wrapped in pity. She answered carefully, the way someone who had weathered commanders and caseworkers learned to answer, brief, measured, and with a buffer of skepticism. They met at a small room in the community center that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paperbacks. Evelyn wore a plain cardigan, not the heels and tailored jackets that usually announced her presence. She sat across from Aisha and listened more than she spoke. She had a way of making space feel safe, not by offering platitudes, but by keeping her questions practical and her promises specific. "When we watched you on the porch," Evelyn said later, "I saw someone who knew how to keep a situation from breaking. That skill is rare. It's also teachable." She slid a folder across the table with an outline of a proposal, a pilot program to transition military canine handlers into civilian roles, in therapy, public safety, and educational settings. "You'd be the first in the pilot, if you'd be interested," she said. "We'd pay you while you train others. We'd help with housing and paperwork." Aisha's first reaction was disbelief. She imagined 1,000 ways this could unravel: promises that evaporated, strings attached, a public story that would make her life a curiosity. She thought of the VA calls that had gone nowhere, the rent notices, the delicate arithmetic of asking for help. But Evelyn's offer was not performative. Over the next few weeks the woman followed through. She arranged a meeting with the housing coordinator and brought a caseworker from the nonprofit to help Aisha begin the mountain of forms the VA loved to hide behind. There were still complications. The VA's bureaucracy required a file that had been misplaced. The housing program had a waiting list that begged for exceptions. The pilot program needed funding approvals. But for the first time in months, Aisha felt not alone in the work of untangling her life. She kept showing up at the community center, training sessions slotted between temp shifts, her hands guided through exercises meant to translate military handling into therapeutic practice. The neighborhood watched in quiet stages. Some people were skeptical. Why would a rich woman take interest? While others felt a small swell of pride for the woman they'd seen under the porch light. Aisha herself remained the same in the ways that meant most. She still boiled water in the same kettle, still hummed lullabies at night, still counted paperwork in the margins of her day. But beneath the routine, something else began to knit, a scaffold of people and small systems that could hold her when life pushed. Reflect for a moment. Who in your life quietly keeps showing up when things are messy? Tag them in the comments and tell us one small way they made a difference. Evelyn never announced a test. She understood that people reveal themselves in the small, unguarded moments, in how they treat a janitor, how they answer a phone call, whether they show up when a plan grows dull and hard. So she set up a string of ordinary obstacles and watched what Aisha did. The first was practical, a community outreach event at a cramped neighborhood elementary school. Evelyn's foundation sponsored a Safety and Companionship Day, a nominal program that paired veterans with local kids, teaching basic dog safety and empathy. Evelyn asked the nonprofit to put Aisha on the roster as an instructor, framed as a chance for a former handler to teach young parents and children how to behave around working dogs. For Aisha, it was low-stakes work, a chance to earn a little and perhaps to humanize a skill she knew could be misunderstood. On the morning of the event, the gym smelled of polished floors and powdered donuts. Colorful banners sagged at the edges. A hand-painted poster read "Welcome. Thank you, vets." Aisha arrived with a borrowed carrier, hand steady, baby strapped in a sling against her chest. She set up a table with pamphlets about canine body language that she'd written the night before on recycled paper. She was not interested in applause. She wanted the children to leave less afraid of dogs than they'd been. The first test took the form of a parent who had read an internet thread and decided expertise came wrapped in suspicion. He demanded to know whether these dogs were safe, under his breath implying that the presence of a black mother and a military background were reasons for caution. He spoke loudly, and the gym's adobe of attention leaned toward conflict. Aisha answered without flinching. She showed him how to present a palm, how to read a tail wag that wasn't joy but stress, how a calm posture could dissolve a child's fear. She removed the edge of the man's questions not by argument but by demonstration. A small live exercise with a gentle therapy dog brought by a volunteer from the shelter. Aisha sat on the floor and let the dog come to her, then encouraged the parent's child to approach. The child's trembling hand found the animal's fur. The adult's anger softened into curiosity. The man later offered his thanks, slower than most people speak when they mean it. Evelyn watched from a folding chair at the back, her sunglasses perched even when indoors as if she preferred a sliver of distance. She catalogued reactions, the way Aisha's voice did not rise when provoked, the attention she paid to the smallest nervous blink, the way she deflected kudos toward volunteers and always mentioned team. The word Evelyn noted most in her mental ledger was constancy, the same measured strength in every scene. The second test was quieter and more personal. Evelyn arranged for a frightened shelter dog, a brindled terrier named Pippin who had been surrendered 3 times, to be placed in Aisha's care for a week as part of a pilot program to retrain dogs for service. It was a practical experiment. Could a handler translate military patterns into therapeutic training that fit civilian life? But it also carried social truth. Dealing with an animal that mistrusted every hand would reveal whether kindness could outlast frustration. Pippin arrived with anxious ears and a history of sharp snaps. At home, Aisha built a small regimen around him. Predictable feeding times, walks that taught boundary and safety, and most challenging, the patience to let the dog refuse progress on some days. When Pippin bit at the leash, Aisha didn't flinch into punishment. She sat on the stoop and hummed that low cadence she used in the field, allowing the dog to choose when to approach her hand. Neighbors watched the little drama. The former soldier crouched on concrete, a baby at her breast, a dog named for a joke and learning to trust again. It would have been easy to be grand about rescue. Instead, Aisha accepted the slow arithmetic of healing. A week later, a shelter volunteer emailed Evelyn, "That dog is calmer. He slept in the same room as the baby last night without whining." Evelyn recorded that note as another tick in the margin. She noticed, too, that Aisha spent money she couldn't entirely spare on Pippin's vet visit. When Evelyn asked if she would reimburse the vet costs, Aisha waved her off. "He needed it," she said. "That's all." The refusal wasn't performative humility. It was the logic of someone who had been taught to prioritize need over their precarious pride. Evelyn's third test was administrative and designed to expose Aisha to the sort of friction that breaks many veterans: bureaucracy. She nudged a shy caseworker to push Aisha's housing application higher up the list and arranged for a missing document to be uploaded in time for a key review. But before the paperwork could be finalized, a glitch in the nonprofit's intake system forced Aisha to show up at City Hall and speak to a desk clerk whose patience had long ago withered. The clerk had the power to stall her case for another 30 days, citing rules and forms. Most days, people in Aisha's position would snap, plead, bribe, cry. Some would lie. Aisha arrived with crisp copies of the form Evelyn had helped produce. The clerk tooted and said a small technicality was missing. Aisha could have left. She could have been muffled into defeat. Instead, she explained the urgency without drama: the baby's age, the medical follow-ups, the rent timeline. She did not use her crisis as a weapon. She asked questions about how to correct the problem and volunteered to return with any additional proof. The clerk's demeanor softened, not because she was bribed with outrage, but because Aisha's straightforwardness made the problem tangible rather than abstract. The clerk found the person who could verify a minor medical record and thumbed through files until the glitch resolved itself. It was a tiny victory in a system that rarely made room for that kind of mercy. All along, Evelyn watched these episodes not through a peephole, but in the daylight of repeated choices. She began to trust that Aisha's deeds were not one-off theatrics, but an architecture of behavior. If there was deviation, a night-side rage or a sudden flash of bitterness, Evelyn didn't see it. The woman's patience, even when her back was near the wall, was the kind of resource that could be multiplied if given dignity and steadiness instead of pity. A more painful test arrived in the form of a temptation. A small security firm called Evelyn's office, offering to fund the pilot program in exchange for priority hiring of their handlers into private contracts. It was the sort of shortcut that could scale impact faster, but would also privatize the training and funnel opportunities to those with money, not necessarily those in need. Evelyn proposed the deal to Aisha as a means of accelerating the program: guaranteed pay, training materials, a modest signing bonus. Aisha listened and then declined. Not because she distrusted growth or the idea of stable work. She declined because the terms risked excluding veterans who lacked credentials or a neat history. "If we build something," she said, "it should be for everyone who needs it, not just the people who can already afford to buy in." Evelyn felt a stab of admiration and a twinge of disappointment. Admiration for the principled refusal, disappointment because accepting would have eased Aisha's immediate financial strain. Testing people often reveals the tester as much as the tested. Evelyn's network began to show itself as both a ladder and a set of levers. She could open doors, but at the cost of certain compromises. Watching Aisha choose inclusivity over an easy personal gain nudged Evelyn's convictions. The philanthropist understood, in that small moral geometry, how power could be deployed without erasing the dignity of those it intended to uplift. By the end of the month, Evelyn's observations had become quiet interventions. She helped redirect a small grant toward the nonprofit with stipulations that preserved public access. She used a contact to secure a temporary stipend for Aisha while the housing paperwork cleared. She never publicized the assistance. Her pleasure was private, the slow, visible change in a life she had watched be steady under pressure. Aisha, for her part, continued to move forward the only way she knew how, with work, tenderness, and refusal to be defined by crisis. She trained, she soothed, she navigated forms. She still rocked the baby to sleep and hummed to Pippin on tough nights. She did not know, not yet, the breadth of Evelyn's influence, only that someone had simply decided to lift a hand and then stayed close enough to help. Think of a time someone tested your character without announcing it. How did you respond? Share a short moment below, and tell us whether the test changed how you see your own strengths. Aisha kept her past like a pocketed talisman, folded small, practical, and almost invisible when she walked through crowds. It was not secreted out of shame so much as weariness. The world loved to fix people's stories into neat, headline-ready shapes, and she had no appetite for being simplified. Still, as she and Evelyn met more often, in the community center, at a battered diner for late coffee, on walks with Pippin while the baby napped, the edges of her history began to show in the way she moved and the stories she let slip. She'd enlisted at 19 after the slow collapse of her father's small auto shop and the steady drift of opportunities that had once seemed possible. The Army offered training and a steady check. It taught her how to braid a rope of routines into survival. In the service she found a rare language, the precise grammar of canine behavior, the way a tilt of an ear could mean the difference between a safe search and a tragedy. She learned to read breath and blink, to know when a tail wag concealed terror, and when a dog's jaw tightened into something dangerously close to despair. That training came with honors and scars. There were deployments that smelled like diesel and sand and the mouths of men who'd stopped being surprised at how near danger lived. The particular memory Aisha kept like a sharp coin was the night on the ridge where she had lost Jory, her partner dog. Jory had been a wide-shouldered Malinois with a scar over one eye and a tendency to try to herd the rest of the unit away from risky edges. They'd been clearing a compound when a secondary blast caught them both off guard. She had felt the world tilt and then pull itself away, the sound of Jory's breath gone like a snapped wire. There were honors later, letters to sign, a medal that felt like a cold certitude pinned to a uniform that smelled of smoke. None of it erased the small raw room in her memory where she kept Jory alive. She had learned then that courage and grief were knotted so closely they sometimes looked like the same thing. After the service, the transition was not cinematic. The civilian world did not value her animal language fluency in most job applications. Employers said she was overqualified for some things and not the right fit for others. The VA forms were a labyrinth of codes and waiting rooms. She tried a handful of day jobs and a few temp placements that drained more than they paid. The limp in her left leg was from a misplaced step on a supply ladder during a storm, an injury that made long hours hard and interviews awkward. At some point, the loneliness of returning to a place where stories ended in "thank you for your service" without follow-up had created a cautious edge. She rarely let anyone pass the porch light. And then, in a quiet, incandescent oval of grief and possibility, she discovered she was pregnant. The news did not come with fanfare. It arrived like a small, bright animal burrowing under the ribs. For a while she thought of ending the deployment of that old life, but keeping the logic of discipline she'd learned. Careful budgets, strict sleep schedules, vigilance. The baby altered everything and nothing. It made panic into a practical task. Keep this small person fed, safe and warm, navigate the VA and housing, and keep the lamp on long enough to finish paperwork. It also returned to her the rawest ache of Jory's absence and nights when a dog's bark on the street could make her chest hollow in the particular way grief lives. Evelyn's backstory was a different kind of weather. She had grown up in houses that were not polished with the kind of restraint most people assume she was born into. Instead, hers had been a series of rooms held together by someone who learned to negotiate survival with a ledger and a stiff spine. Evelyn inherited a company from an aunt who taught her to count people's needs like columns on a balance sheet. She learned early that money could be leverage for dignity if wielded without a pedestal. Unlike the philanthropists who loved certificates and press releases, Evelyn preferred quiet interventions. She kept a small team of people who tracked needs and outcomes the way a gardener tracks seasons. The weeks that followed felt less like a straight line and more like a ladder with evenly spaced rungs. Each meeting between Aisha and Evelyn was a rung, small, steady, reachable. The rhythm of their connection surprised Aisha. It had none of the loud instruments of charity she'd learned to distrust. Instead, it arrived in practical things: calls to check whether a document had been uploaded, a predictable stipend that arrived on the day her rent was due, a steady invitation to the community center where Aisha began to teach short classes on canine safety. Evelyn's presence became less a spectacle and more a constancy, something like daylight after months of fog. Aisha kept working her temp shifts, folding boxes and moving pallets in the dim hum of the distribution center. She trained in the evenings and early mornings when the baby napped, translating the brutal efficiency of military commands into language parents and teachers could use. She learned to open her lessons with stories, brief, humanizing snapshots of Jory, of a hillside at dawn, of the small signs that told her a dog was frightened rather than aggressive. People listened in a way they hadn't when she tried to explain her work in interviews. The neutrality of the community center allowed them to see skill without spectacle. A room full of parents and kids would lean toward the woman who explained the world through softness and timing. Evelyn watched those classes with a restrained pride that never spilled into patronizing language. She would catch Aisha's eye from the back of the room and give a small, almost imperceptible nod. Neither woman needed a stage. They needed impact. After one session where a nervous father learned to read his son's tentative posture and then guided him to pet a therapy dog without fear, the father's gratitude was simple and raw. "I thought I'd have to get used to living with my kid's fear," he said. "I didn't expect to learn how to help him." That kind of feedback rewired what Aisha thought her work could become. Outside the classroom, the two of them found other ways to close the gap between aid and dignity. Evelyn arranged a modest apartment near the community center, a place with clean floors and a small yard where the baby could crawl without immediately finding a shard of plaster. It was transitional, not permanent, a promise with an end, but it was the kind of breathing space that made forms feel conquerable. Aisha painted one wall with a muted blue and hung a small shelf where she kept the baby's socks and a faded photograph of a dog with a scar over one eye. Pippin took to pacing the yard like a guard whose teeth had been softened into watchfulness. The growing connection between the two women was not merely transactional. There were evenings when they found themselves pushing chairs together in the community center's small kitchen, talking until the fluorescent lights hummed low and the janitor swept the last crumbs into a pan. Evelyn disclosed more about the losses she'd learned to hold: a sister who'd vanished into addiction, a husband who'd left without reason when she was still learning to count people's needs, and Aisha, in turn, let the ridge and Jory's absence surface in quiet detail. They traded confidence for confidence in a way that felt like a shared, practical intimacy. One afternoon crystallized the trust between them. Aisha had been scheduled for a pilot interview, one that could lead to a salaried role training teams to work with service animals in schools and hospitals. It was the sort of opportunity that could change the arithmetic of her life, but the interview conflicted with a doctor's appointment for the baby. She called Evelyn with a kind of small panic that came from balancing too many urgent things. Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Bring the baby," she said. "I'll take notes." On the day of the interview, Evelyn arrived at the community center with an armful of resources, a folder of the pilot program's objectives, a list of partner hospitals, and a quiet confidence that suggested she had already done some of the work. She had also called in a favor, a pediatrician friend who agreed to meet Aisha for a quick checkup while she interviewed. The way Evelyn moved through the day made each practical intervention feel like a normal part of life rather than an act of mercy. After the interview, which Aisha navigated with a steady professionalism she hadn't yet allowed herself to own, Evelyn squeezed her hand and said, "You did exactly what you came to do." Their bond deepened in smaller ways as well. Evelyn learned the baby's nudge and the exact time Aisha liked to warm the bottles. Aisha began to leave spare cans of formula on the community pantry shelf and to trade her own small victories. A dog who no longer flinched, a child who no longer trembled, with Evelyn like currency. They also navigated tension. Once Evelyn asked if Aisha would consider speaking at a donor's dinner to highlight the pilot program. Aisha's immediate reaction was recoil. The idea of being put on display felt like a violation. Evelyn listened, abetted the plan, and instead suggested a private roundtable of teachers and clinicians where Aisha could speak more practically without performance. The decision not to push showed Evelyn's respect for boundaries and deepened the trust. Aisha's life, still tense with paperwork and nights of interrupted sleep, began to feel like it had slats you could climb rather than a cliff you might tumble from. Small victories accrued. The VA responded to a document after Evelyn's persistent nudges. A housing inspection showed the apartment needed only a minor repair. Pippin learned to sleep through the baby's cries without pacing the room. The changes did not erase the daily grind, but they changed its contour. Community response shifted, too. Mrs. Latham left a casserole with a handwritten note that read simply, "For strength." Isaiah the clerk started setting aside discounted formula with an apologetic shrug and a smile. Even the distribution center foreman offered a half-joking compliment. "Those classes of yours actually help keep pups off pallets." The neighborhood's small acts gathered like weather, not always predictable but often steadying. One night, in a sting of confession between sweeping and coffee refills, Aisha admitted a private fear to Evelyn, that she was being propped up only until someone more marketable could take the place she'd carved out. "What if they want a polished speaker and not someone with a limp and a baby?" she asked, voice small in the empty room. Evelyn gave an answer that did more than comfort. "Then we don't build for the polished," she said. "We build for the people who show up when things are messy." It was both a strategy and a promise. The line cut through Aisha's suspicion and planted a small seed of courage, that a program could be designed for the imperfect and still be sustainable. As the pilot's launch drew nearer, Aisha's confidence grew in tandem with her responsibilities. She designed modules that married canine behavior with trauma-informed language and practiced them on local school staff who'd volunteered. She also mentored a teen from the neighborhood, Jamal, a lanky high schooler who'd been suspended twice and found solace in carrying boxes at the center. Jamal, nervous around animals at first, began to show up to Aisha's classes with a sheet of notes and an awkward eagerness that became a steady presence. Teaching him, Aisha realized, was not just about dogs. It was about teaching someone to trust the small steps toward something dependable. The growing connection reached beyond the two women and folded others into its orbit. A modest donor network formed from people who had attended the private roundtable. A local clinic agreed to partner on mental health check-ins for handlers and families. The pilot wasn't dazzling. It was stubbornly sensible. That steadiness made it durable. And yet, with all the slow construction of trust and infrastructure, a new pressure began to creep in at the edges. Pilot funding had timelines. The housing solution was still transitional. The nonprofit had its own stakeholders whose patience could thin. Aisha felt the weight of impending responsibilities not as a promise but as a test. Could she keep her humility and compassion as the work scaled? Could she resist the urge to trade inclusivity for efficiency? Evelyn's hands tightened on her coffee cup once, a rare visible show of concern. "Scaling is where compromises hide," she said aloud in a way that included both of them. "We'll have to be vigilant about what we lose as we grow." Aisha nodded. The baby stirred in the next room, and the small rhythm of life kept its steady, demanding beat. The connection between them had become strong enough that both women could recognize a threat to the integrity of what they were building. They had forged a partnership that trusted work over spectacle and dignity over quick headlines. It was a fragile thing, like anything that mattered, and it would be tested. Who has helped you build something steady rather than flashy? Tag them below and share one small way their consistent presence made a difference in your life. Spring carried the scent of damp soil and blooming trees into the city, but for Aisha, it also carried deadlines. The pilot program was about to roll out in its first partner school, a small elementary on the east side with tight funding and a history of behavioral challenges. For weeks, she had trained Jamal, refined lesson plans, and prepped therapy dogs borrowed from a clinic. Still, the weight on her chest wasn't about curriculum. It was about proving the program was real, proving she was more than a story. The morning of launch, parents filled folding chairs in the school gym, teachers stood with arms crossed, and the principal, a man with tired eyes, whispered, "We'll see if this works." It was not hostile, just wary. The dogs shifted on their leashes, sniffing the polished floor. Aisha steadied them with a low hum, the same sound she'd used under desert suns to keep Jory calm before raids. Her hands did not shake, though her knees ached. When a boy named Caleb, infamous for throwing desks, was invited to approach, the gym held its breath. Caleb's fists were balled, his jaw set. But Aisha crouched to his level, speaking about giving space and listening to what a body says. The boy reached out, first with a shove, then with a trembling palm. The dog, a mellow retriever named Scout, leaned into him instead of recoiling. Caleb blinked hard, then whispered he didn't run. For the first time, a small eruption of applause filled the gym. The pilot day ended not with spectacle but with something sturdier, teachers asking for sign-up sheets, parents lingering to ask questions, kids laughing around dogs who had once been symbols of fear. Evelyn, watching from the back, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the test wasn't just in the school gym. The very next week, a city council member visited the community center to observe. The man wore a crisp suit, carried donor influence, and spoke in clipped sentences about scaling potential. His eyes slid past Aisha's limp and the baby napping in a stroller, focusing instead on metrics and expansion models. He wanted numbers, charts, and assurances. Evelyn answered most of his questions, deflecting when his tone edged toward condescension. But when he finally turned to Aisha with, "And what qualifies you to lead such a program long-term?" the room went silent. It was the kind of question designed to puncture. Aisha inhaled, feeling her throat tighten. Then, instead of defending herself with credentials she didn't have, she spoke with the clarity of someone who had earned knowledge the hard way. "Because I know what fear looks like before it turns dangerous," she said evenly. "I know how to teach a child to approach instead of withdraw, How to teach a handler to notice the small signs that prevent harm. You don't need to trust my resume. Trust the kids and dogs you saw today. The room held its breath again. Jamal, standing in the corner, nodded fiercely as if to punctuate the statement. The councilman's jaw shifted, and though he gave no outward approval, his next words were softer. We'll be in touch. That evening, after the councilman left, Evelyn clasped Aisha's shoulder. You didn't bend. That matters more than you realize. But the big test was not over. A local paper published a skeptical op-ed. Is the city funding a feel-good project or a sustainable program? The article minimized Aisha's role, framing her as a figurehead veteran propped up by donors. The sting was sharp. Old doubts clawed back. Evelyn urged patience, but Aisha lay awake listening to her baby's soft breaths, wondering if she was being carried again instead of building her own footing. The big test, she realized, wasn't just about schools or donors. It was about whether she could step fully into leadership without letting others rewrite her story. And soon, an even greater challenge would force her to decide. The program's momentum was undeniable. Schools requested waiting lists, a few parents sent thank-you notes, and Scout, the retriever who had won over Caleb, became a kind of mascot. Yet, as quickly as praise spread, so did resistance. The op-ed questioning Aisha's qualifications seeded doubt, and whispers of charity case floated in City Hall. The crisis arrived on a rainy Thursday. Evelyn called Aisha into the community center office, her voice unusually taut. The council's budget committee is divided. Some are pushing to cut the pilot funding before it even completes. And, she hesitated, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were printouts, social media screenshots, nasty comments, a headline that read, "Unfit Veteran Endangers Children with K-9 Experiments." Aisha stared at the words until they blurred. Her hands trembled, not from fear of losing money, but from the raw ache of being painted as dangerous in front of her own neighbors. She thought of the dogs lunging that night on her porch, of the way she'd calmed them. Now it was people who needed calming, but words, unlike animals, couldn't be soothed with tone alone. That evening, she walked the cracked sidewalks with her baby strapped to her chest. Jamal met her outside the bodega, his face stormy. "You gonna let them talk like that? You saved me, sis. You saved Caleb. They don't get to erase that." But Aisha's chest burned with the old tug-of-war, keep her head low to survive, or stand tall and risk being broken again. She remembered nights in uniform when she spoke up for her unit and was punished with silence. Now, civilians were doing the same thing. The crisis climaxed at a public council hearing. Aisha wasn't scheduled to speak, but as parents and teachers trickled up to the mic with cautious support, the same skeptical councilman cleared his throat. These programs cost money. Veterans may have good intentions, but that does not equal expertise. Murmurs rippled. All eyes shifted toward Aisha in the audience. Her baby whimpered, as if sensing the moment. Aisha rose, knees aching, and walked slowly to the microphone. The room hushed. She did not read from notes. She didn't have any. "I know what it means to be seen as a threat," she began. "On deployment, I worked with dogs trained to attack on command. I also worked with children in villages who feared those dogs the way some children here fear police sirens. I learned something simple. Fear grows when we don't listen. But healing grows when someone is willing to kneel, to wait, to extend a hand instead of a weapon." She paused, her voice thick. "I am not a resume. I am a mother, a handler, a veteran, a neighbor. And I will keep teaching kids to see dogs not as weapons, but as partners. If you cut this program, you're not just cutting me. You're cutting the chance for kids like Caleb to believe they can be trusted with something powerful and gentle at the same time. The silence stretched. Then, from the back, Caleb's mother stood. She gave my son hope. That's worth more than any line item. Other parents followed, voices layering. Even a teacher who had once been skeptical raised her hand. The pilot saved us more discipline calls in a month than we've seen in years. The councilman shifted uncomfortably, but Evelyn smiled, not triumphant, but proud. For the first time, Aisha had stepped fully into her own defense, not waiting for someone else to speak for her. The crisis wasn't over, but the room felt shifted. A seed of legitimacy had been planted, and everyone there had witnessed it. The hearing adjourned late, the council deferring its final vote. Aisha left the building with her baby against her chest, Jamal trailing close behind, Evelyn walking quietly at her side. Rain glazed the pavement, streetlights shimmering in long golden lines. For once, Aisha did not feel invisible. She felt raw, seen, exposed, but also steady. 2 days later, Evelyn asked her to meet at a downtown cafe. It wasn't the usual diner near the community center. This place had floor-to-ceiling windows, marble counters, and the kind of hush that comes from people conducting quiet business deals. Aisha shifted uneasily in the plush seat, her thrift store coat damp from drizzle. Evelyn placed a folder on the table. "It's time I tell you something," she said, her voice both warm and serious. Inside the folder was not criticism or news clippings but documents, incorporation papers, a funding proposal, even a logo design mock-up. At the bottom, Aisha's name was typed in bold, Director of the K9 Youth Initiative. "I didn't just happen upon you that night," Evelyn confessed. "I've been funding veteran transition projects for years. I often go into communities quietly, to see the people themselves, not the polished resumes, not the staged presentations. I wanted to know who you really were when the world pushed against you." Aisha blinked, stunned. "So you've been watching me?" Evelyn smiled softly. "Not watching. Learning. And what I learned is this: your calm under fire, your instinct to nurture, your ability to read both animals and people, those can't be taught in a seminar. They are lived. They are rare. And they're exactly what this city, these kids, and frankly, this country needs." Tears welled in Aisha's eyes. She thought of the porch that night, the snarling dogs, her baby clutched to her chest. She had acted out of survival, not ambition. Yet here she was, being handed not pity, but trust. Evelyn continued, her tone steady. "I want to fund this program for 5 years, salaries, facilities, everything. But not as charity. As partnership. You lead it. You hire staff. You set the tone. I'll be there to advise and back you up, but this has to be yours." Aisha's throat tightened. "Why me?" she whispered. Evelyn leaned forward. "Because you didn't just control those dogs. You transformed fear into trust. That night, you showed me that true leadership is not about command. It's about compassion." The cafe seemed to fall away. Aisha looked down at her baby, sleeping peacefully in her sling, and felt a surge of something she hadn't known in years: safety. Not just for herself, but for the life she was raising. In the months that followed, transformation unfolded like dawn spreading light. The program secured funding. The skeptical councilman eventually became an ally, citing reduced juvenile incidents and improved classroom climates. Jamal was hired as a youth coordinator, his pride written in the way he carried clipboards and spoke with parents. Caleb, the once defiant boy, became a peer mentor, teaching other kids how to approach dogs with patience. Most of all, Aisha discovered a new rhythm. Her limp remained, her nights with the baby were still restless, but her sense of purpose filled the cracks. She was no longer defined by the label of struggling veteran or single mother. She was Director Canty, mentor, leader, the woman who had turned a moment of danger into a future of possibility. And every time she walked into a classroom with Scout at her side, every time a child whispered, "He didn't run," she remembered that porch, that night, and the choice she made to meet force with calm. Kindness, she realized, had not just saved her. It had built her a home, a future, a legacy. What would you have done that night on the porch, faced with barking dogs and fear? Would you have met force with anger, or tried to meet it with calm? How might one small act of restraint change the entire course of someone's life? Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Check out more videos on my channel and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.